What happens when a humble woman saves a millionaire's son without knowing who he is? A tale of karma and grace. Is every encounter in life seeded by destiny? Or is it simply coincidence, when two people from worlds that should never have crossed paths meet each other in the midst of a freezing rain? Rain poured relentlessly over the highlands of Chiapas. The sky hung heavy in a dull leaden gray, thunder rumbling like lamentations from the earth's core, and gusts of wind swept fiercely over the terraced fields burdened with harvest. In this mountain region, rain wasn't just water from the sky, it was a test, a way of life for those accustomed to nature's harshness. Elena, a 34-year-old woman from the Tzotzil community, hurried along the slippery red dirt trail. On her shoulder hung an old cloth bag filled with freshly picked medicinal leaves. In her heart, a storm brewed, 2 children waiting for dinner, a thatched roof leaking for days, and her daughter's sweater fraying just as the cold returned. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed wholeheartedly, not since the day her husband crossed the border into the US 3 years ago and vanished without a single letter. A faded green nylon umbrella was pressed tightly against her body, shielding her from the biting wind that threatened to topple her small frame. Elena wasn't one to complain. She was used to hardship, used to facing nature, society, and the fading echoes of dreams trapped in a smoky kitchen, all alone. Suddenly, a strange sound tore through the rain, the sputter of a car engine, then a sharp screech like a wounded animal. Elena stopped and looked toward the muddy slope. In the dim light, she spotted a sleek black SUV stuck in the wet sludge. A surreal sight in a place where even ox carts struggled, let alone luxury cars from the capital. The car door flung open, and a man in a dark suit leapt out. In an instant, his expensive clothing soaked through, and his neatly styled hair clung to his forehead in dripping strands. But what struck Elena most was the look in his eyes: panic, confusion, and something close to despair. He didn't look like someone used to facing uncertainty. He looked like a man who'd just wandered into a world that didn't belong to him. "Ayuda, por favor. Help me. My son is sick." The cry for help pierced the torrential downpour. Elena hesitated for a moment. 2 opposing thoughts battled in her mind. One warned her of city people, strangers she should steer clear of. The other echoed her late mother's voice: if someone is in pain, even a stranger, you must help. Because karma travels with the wind. She stepped forward. It wasn't a spontaneous act. It was instinct, an impulse born from a soul that had once healed others with nothing but forest herbs and whispered prayers under the moonlight. She approached the vehicle. A boy, around 10, lay curled in the back seat, his face pale and glistening with sweat, his body trembling. He groaned as if a knife twisted in his stomach. Elena didn't ask questions. She looked at him, then gently placed her skilled hand on his forehead. "He's burning up, he has a high fever." The man, whose name, Elena would later learn, was Alejandro, quickly explained that they'd gotten lost when a landslide confused the GPS route. While trying to find a detour, his son had suddenly fallen gravely ill. "My home is 10 minutes on foot from here. No one else can help you. The roads are cut off." Alejandro didn't think twice. He scooped his son into his arms, his designer shoes sinking into the mud, and followed Elena down a path overgrown with shrubs, under the relentless rain that seemed to test the soul itself. It was a moment of destiny. A powerful, wealthy father utterly helpless. And a poor mother seemingly fragile, carrying the ancient strength of the forest and an unconditional compassion carved by time. And so, when they stepped into Elena's humble earthen home, where the warm scent of oil lamps and herbal grass lingered in every corner, a journey between 2 worlds quietly began. Elena's home, though poor, was strangely comforting and neat. Its crooked red-tiled roof shielded against the storm, and the bare brick walls were carefully lined with old newspapers to keep out the cold. Under the flicker of the oil lamp, the room radiated a kind of modest grace, simple, but deeply human. Alejandro laid Mateo, his son, on a simple bed covered in a hand-woven wool blanket. Elena had knitted that very blanket last year, during one stormy night, while nursing her own son Luisito through a high fever. She moved calmly, not rushed, not alarmed. Something in her eyes settled Alejandro, even in his anxiety. "What's his name?" "Mateo. Mateo Ruiz Vega." The surname made Elena pause briefly. It sounded familiar, perhaps from a TV news broadcast she once saw outside an old electronics stall at the market. But it didn't matter. To her, he wasn't the child of a tycoon. He was just another sick boy fighting a fever like the many she'd cared for in these highlands. Elena felt Mateo's forehead, checked his pulse by resting her ear on his chest, then gently pressed on his stomach. "It's not appendicitis. It's acute food poisoning. Likely from contaminated food you brought with you." Alejandro frowned and pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. He paced back and forth, searching for a way to reconnect with the world he knew. Each time he looked at his shivering son, helplessness clawed at his chest. "I think I should call for a medical helicopter. I know someone in the emergency response unit." Elena simply shook her head. In her eyes was the calm of someone who no longer expected help from the outside, only faith in her own hands and heart. "No one flies in this weather. And no one will reach here in 3 hours. But I can help. If you let me do it my way." Alejandro didn't answer. But his reluctant nod marked the beginning of a strange bond between a man used to commanding million-dollar operations, and a woman who survived by foraging forest leaves. Elena moved with the grace of a seasoned doctor, though she wore no lab coat. She asked Marisol to bring her the eucalyptus leaf and cinnamon bark tea brewed earlier that morning. She sent Luisito to get towels and ice from the old freezer, the one luxury they owned, bought with 2 years of savings. She wiped Mateo's forehead, placed cold compresses, and dropped herbal tea onto his cracked lips. When he began to vomit, she gently cradled his head, cleaning him as if he were her own child. Alejandro stood motionless in the corner. He had seen the best doctors at work in ICU rooms lit like stadiums, filled with machines and sterile precision. Every word measured like a legal contract. But this woman, she had no tech, no degrees, only eyes that listened and hands that healed. The night stretched on like a sacred chant. Rain still poured outside. But inside the earthen home, life began to return. Mateo's breathing steadied. Color bloomed faintly in his pale cheeks. The fever, like a thief caught in the act, slowly receded in silence. As the clock neared midnight, Elena placed a clay cup of black coffee on the old table beside Alejandro. "Drink. You'll need to stay alert for tomorrow." Alejandro sat down and took the cup. The warmth spread from his hands to his chest. In that quiet moment, he realized he wasn't witnessing a medical emergency but something far deeper. A quiet miracle. One where life wasn't saved by money, but by presence and love. Elena said nothing more. She returned to Mateo's side, sitting there like a guardian spirit. And Alejandro, perhaps for the first time in his life, felt small before someone who had nothing but a heart. That night, the wind kept howling through the cracks in the door, the rain showed no intention of stopping, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl hooted, a sound signaling the turning of time, the moment when night begins to surrender to dawn. Elena never took her eyes off Mateo, not for a second. She sat silently beside the bed, occasionally placing her hand on his forehead to feel the shift in temperature. The burning fever had slowly receded, replaced by steady breathing like a lullaby from the earth, sung only to those patient enough to wait. Alejandro lay curled up on the thin mat Elena had prepared in the corner of the room, staring up at the crooked tile roof. The rain tapped in steady rhythms, not noisy, but almost like the forest whispering to him. And in that humble space, full of life and lack, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. A strange peace. Not because of silence, but because the struggle inside him had paused. Elena turned to him, her voice gentle but clear, like a small bell echoing through an ancient temple. "Can't sleep?" Alejandro nodded. He sat up and pulled on the thick wool sweater she had left for him. "I'm used to sleeping in air-conditioned rooms with the hum of machines. Here, everything is alive. The rain, the wind, the breathing of the earth. That's what we call the voice of Mother Earth. Once you get used to it, it's more comforting than any soundproof wall." She smiled, her eyes gazing at the flickering oil lamp. Alejandro had never seen anyone speak about nature with such a look filled with affection, as if the land and sky were her lifelong companions. "Where did you learn traditional medicine?" he asked. Elena paused for a moment before answering. "From my grandmother. She healed with her hands and her heart. When I was little and caught a cold or had a stomachache, she wouldn't use medicine, just held my hand, rubbed my back, and quietly murmured something. As I got older, I realized, it wasn't the leaves that healed, but faith and love." Alejandro stayed silent. He thought of his hospitals where patients were given ID numbers, injected, operated on, tested, but rarely did anyone have time to hold their hand and simply be there. "Aren't you ever afraid of the responsibility? Treating without a license?" Elena smiled softly, but there was no sarcasm in that smile. "If a child is in pain and I do nothing, that's my fault. But if I do everything I can, and still can't save them, that's their karma. I don't heal with legality, I heal with my heart." A quiet stillness passed between them, like an underground stream. Alejandro suddenly asked, "Have you never dreamed of a different life? A big city, a beautiful home, a more comfortable life?" Elena looked at him. Her gaze was so deep, Alejandro felt like a man standing before a vast ocean, unable to swim. "I used to dream. But then I realized the most beautiful life is when you live fully with what you have. It's not about rejecting the future but not losing the present. Waking up to my children's laughter, hearing roosters crow, smelling the forest leaves, that is peace." Alejandro felt a lump in his throat. He remembered mornings in his glass-walled penthouse, the coffee machine beeping, his inbox overflowing with work emails, and the cold silence in his heart. Then, a faint groan from Mateo broke his thoughts. They both walked quickly to the bedside. The boy opened his eyes. Though still cloudy, his breath was steady. Elena placed a hand on his forehead and nodded gently. "The fever's gone. He just needs rest and something light to eat in the morning." Alejandro exhaled deeply, nearly dropping to his knees to thank the woman he had, only hours earlier, regarded with skepticism. "I'm grateful. More than words can say." Elena didn't respond. She simply poured warm water into a small bowl, gently wiped Mateo's hands, and reminded, "You should sleep. There's a long road ahead tomorrow." That night, Alejandro lay back down on the mat, hands clasped over his chest. In his mind, one phrase echoed, it wasn't the leaves that healed but faith and love. And maybe, he, too, had begun to heal. The next morning, As soft sunlight filtered over the mountain ridges surrounding the valley, Elena's home looked like it had been washed clean by the night's rain. The air was rich with the scent of wet earth, forest leaves, and a faint whiff of coffee from the wood stove. Chickens clucked in the yard, waking the forest as if no one had just lived through a difficult night. Mateo had slept deeply for the first time in days, undisturbed by stomach pain or fever sweats. When he opened his eyes, what he saw wasn't the familiar ceiling of the villa in Chapultepec, but a dark wooden roof, bundles of drying herbs hanging above, and Elena's gentle smile. "How are you feeling?" "Better, but a little thirsty." Elena brushed his hair back and poured him a glass of salted lemon water. "Sip slowly. Your stomach's still weak." Alejandro stood quietly by the doorway, watching. A strange feeling rose in his chest as if he were standing outside his own life, watching it rearrange itself, piece by piece. He had seen dozens of skilled nurses, hundreds of world-class doctors. But never had he seen anyone care with such tenderness and sincerity as this woman. No urgency, no judgment, no questions about who the boy was, just a human being in pain, receiving love. When breakfast ended with a steaming bowl of rice porridge, soft-boiled eggs, a few banana slices, and a warm smile, Alejandro knew one thing for certain: this connection could not end here. After Marisol and Luisito had left for school, Alejandro sat across from Elena in the small front yard. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, whispering its quiet approval. "I have a proposal. Please hear me out." Elena furrowed her brow and wiped her hands on her apron. A quiet intuition told her this wouldn't be simple. "I'm listening. I'd like to invite you and your children to come to Mexico City to live with my family for a while. Mateo needs time to recover, and I believe only you can make him feel safe." Elena's eyes widened in surprise. In the stillness of the mountains, that offer rang out like a bell, disrupting every rhythm she knew. "I don't understand. I'm just a native woman, with no degree, no background. I don't belong in your world." "My world," Alejandro interrupted, "couldn't help my son last night." "But you did. And more than that, Mateo trusts you." He smiled, for the first time in months, while talking to your children. "I haven't seen that smile since his mother died." Elena said nothing. His words didn't make her proud, they made her tremble. Because for the first time in her life, someone saw her true worth, not through what she lacked, but through what she had given. "I can't abandon my home. The herb garden, the chickens, my children's school. I'll pay someone from the village, anyone you trust, to care for your home, animals, and plants. You'll be compensated fairly. You'll have your own space in the city, and your children can study in the best schools. Just for a few weeks. After that, you can return, if you choose." Elena didn't answer immediately. She needed time. She needed approval, not just from herself, but more importantly, from her children. That afternoon, when Marisol and Luisito returned with their old backpacks and eyes sparkling after a school day, Elena served them dinner and shared the story. Luisito nearly jumped up with excitement. "Mama, really? We're going to the city? Is that where the Azteca Stadium is? And the Dinosaur Museum?" Marisol, more contemplative, asked softly. "What about school here? Your garden? The mornings when you teach me letters in the sunlight? If we leave, will we come back?" Elena took her daughter's hand and looked into her 12-year-old eyes, aged beyond their years. "We won't lose anything. I just want you both to have more opportunities. A chance to see a bigger world but never forget your roots." and if one day you want to return, I will always return with you." Marisol stayed quiet for a long moment, then nodded. And in that moment, Elena knew, the decision had been made. Not by a mother alone but by a family. Elena's heart pounded as the helicopter slowly descended over what looked like a painting come to life, a vast, manicured garden. The city skyline stretched out like a giant silver carpet, sunlight bouncing off sleek rooftops, mingled with faint tendrils of mist. Luisito gasped in delight, while Marisol clutched her mother's hand, eyes wide in awe. Mateo, seated beside them, seemed used to it, but the look he gave Elena was filled with unhidden excitement. "Are we landing in his backyard?" Elena asked softly. Alejandro nodded with a warm smile, one that no longer held the distance of a master to a helper. But to Elena, this place felt like another planet. She had never stepped outside her small village, never flown before, and certainly never imagined something like a mansion with a helicopter pad. The blade stopped. The door opened. City wind rushed in, carrying the scent of imported roses, asphalt, and unfamiliarity. Before them stood a 3-story white house with minimalist architecture, modern to the point of coldness. The columns gleamed like marble, floor-to-ceiling glass panels shimmered, and jet-black stone steps seemed to belong to a futuristic world. Outside, a group was waiting: maids, drivers, a housekeeper, and a chef, all in polished uniforms, bowing respectfully as Alejandro stepped out. "Carmen, this is Elena and her children. They are our honored guests. I ask that you treat them like my own family." Carmen, the head housekeeper, a sharp-eyed woman of mature age, smiled politely, then nodded gently to Elena. "It's a pleasure to welcome you. Everything has been prepared." Yet Elena couldn't ignore the first glances from the others. They hid it well, but in those brief looks was something she recognized all too well: judgment. Her coarse linen dress, the worn sandals, her Tatsil-style braid all made her feel like a misplaced detail in a flawless picture. She didn't blame them. In a place this luxurious, a barefoot indigenous woman stepping out of a helicopter must have seemed unimaginable. "We'll escort you and the children to the East Wing, near Mateo's room. Each of you will have your own room, fully equipped. If you need anything, just press the bell." Carmen led them through a long corridor flanked by abstract art and modern decor Elena didn't dare to examine. With every step, her heart tightened, not out of fear, but from the sharp, painful clarity that she did not belong here. Then a door opened, and it felt like stepping into a dream. A massive bed with pure white velvet covers, fur-covered armchairs, polished oak floors, a wardrobe filled with dresses from high-end embroidered Mexican wear to imported athletic gear. On the desk sat a new laptop, bilingual books, and toys for the children. "Dear God," Elena whispered. Luisito practically bounced, running from corner to corner. "Mama, this room is bigger than our whole house." Marisol said nothing, but her eyes sparkled with quiet wonder. Elena knew her daughter was holding back emotions to avoid worrying her. Carmen smiled. "We prepared clothing suited to your style. We consulted a specialist in contemporary indigenous fashion. If anything doesn't fit, please let us know." Elena nodded her thanks. But inside, a storm churned. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the hospitality. It was that, the more she was honored, the more she felt like a foreign object, pampered, but alien. She sat on the edge of the bed, covering her face with her hands. Her heart raced. The gentle fragrance in the room, the hint of designer perfume, made her dizzy. She didn't cry. A woman who had survived storms, poverty, abandonment, she didn't allow herself to break. But in her mind, one question echoed. Can I ever truly belong here, or is this just a fleeting dream? A while later, there was a knock. It was Alejandro. Are you all right? Do the kids like the room? Elena gave a faint smile. They're happy. And I'm trying to adjust. Alejandro stepped closer, resting his hand on the back of a chair, his voice softer than usual. Elena, I know everything here feels strange. But I didn't bring you here to change you. I brought you here to be yourself, the person my son trusts, the one who brought him back to life. She looked at him, his sincerity transparent. Then she glanced at her children, Marisol reading, Luisito discovering that the bathroom had auto-heated water. Maybe she needed time. But more than that, she needed to hold on to the most original part of herself. I won't turn into someone else, Alejandro. Even in a castle. I don't want you to, he replied. I just want you to be present. And that sentence felt like a thread stitching her back to herself. 3 days passed since Elena and her children arrived in the city. Time, which used to flow slowly in her village, now sped forward with digital clocks, chauffeurs, and full schedules. And yet, Elena didn't get lost. She wasn't swallowed by the glamour, but stood like solid earth amid swirling winds. Mateo began to change. No longer the quiet boy huddled in corners with suspicious eyes, now he followed Luisito like a shadow. They played video games, chased each other around the pool, shouted joyfully, just kids, no class barriers, no walls of wealth or language. Marisol, initially shy, became curious. She explored Alejandro's vast library, reading everything from Mexican history to Buddhist fables in Spanish. Once, Elena walked in to find her daughter explaining the solar system to Mateo, her fingers drawing circles in the air, as if she'd forgotten who she was and remembered only the joy of discovery. Alejandro, once only present in the early mornings and late nights, began spending more time at home. Dinner was no longer a stiff ritual with candlelight and clinking silverware, it became a warm table with hot soup, Elena's handmade corn cakes, and the laughter of 3 children. He started eating with his hands, sampling tamales wrapped by Elena, sitting on wooden chairs instead of designer leather sofas, not because anyone asked him to, but because something inside him wanted to be closer. One rainy afternoon, while the children made paper airplanes in the living room, Alejandro sat with Elena under the porch awning. At first, they said nothing. Only the rain tapping softly on stone tiles, and the scent of mint from Carmen's garden surrounded them. Mateo has never spoken this much, he said finally, his voice low. I took him to therapy, hired top specialists, no one got through to him like this. Elena shrugged, not out of modesty, but because she truly didn't think she had done anything extraordinary. I just treated him like a child who needed love. Not someone's son, just a soul in pain. Alejandro looked at her. In his eyes was something deeper than gratitude and awakening. The kind that makes a man realize how much of life he'd missed chasing things that couldn't be measured. Did you study child psychology? No. But I was once a child who was left behind. I know how that feels. Elena didn't cry. She wasn't bitter. Her voice was light, as if stating a simple fact, free from blame. But Alejandro was silent. Something inside him crumbled, some shell he had built for years, convincing himself that money could replace presence, and gifts could cover the absence of love. The next day, he asked Carmen to hand Elena a carefully wrapped parcel. Inside was a wooden box filled with rare seeds from all over Mexico, cinnamon from Oaxaca, highland mint, nutmeg from the north, even a small pouch labeled Semillas de Sabiduría, Seeds of Wisdom. Attached was a handwritten note. I'd like to help you build a healing garden here just like the one you have back home. Not to make you forget Chiapas, but to remind you that you'll always have roots, no matter where you are. Alejandro. Elena sat and gazed at the box for a long time. Her fingers gently traced each small packet, as if they weren't just seeds but pieces of her soul that someone had seen and valued. She thought to herself, maybe, this place isn't entirely foreign. Maybe, if I can keep my heart whole, then even in a city of lights, I am still Elena, the one who heals with her hands, her spirit, and the belief that human connection transcends all borders. That morning, Elena was carefully planting seeds into small clay pots set along the porch, her new herb garden slowly taking shape, one row at a time, like the opening notes of a symphony composed from memory and hope. As she watered the soil, she quietly recited a small prayer passed down from her grandmother. Each seed sown is a seed of virtue. Each sprout grown is a step of compassion. No one knew it, but for Elena, planting medicine was never just a habit, it was a ritual. A way to connect with her ancestors, with Mother Earth, and with her truest self. Mateo sat nearby, sketchbook in hand, drawing imaginary leaves. He was no longer just a boy being cared for, he was becoming her first student in this strange city. His constant, curious questions, what is this for, had become routine. Elena always answered patiently, explaining each herb's use, how and when to harvest it, and most importantly, with what heart. But peace is never permanent, especially in a world where power often walks hand in hand with prejudice. That afternoon, Dona Mercedes, Alejandro's mother, returned from Europe. The press often called her the iron backbone of the Ruiz Vega Empire, sharp, commanding, and unyielding when it came to standards. The house, once alive with children's laughter and the scent of healing herbs, seemed to drop in temperature the moment her sleek black car pulled up to the gate. Elena stood, wiping her hands on her apron. Marisol and Luisito tucked themselves behind her, wary. Mateo ran to greet his grandmother, but his steps were timid, unlike the comfort he shared with Elena. He clutched his shirt nervously, as if sensing the gentleness of the days was about to shift. "Good afternoon, Señora," Elena greeted politely. Dona Mercedes looked her over from head to toe, her eyes like an invisible scale, measuring every hair, every fold in Elena's dress, every step she took. She nodded, barely, but it was cold. "You are Elena?" "Yes. I've been caring for Mateo while he recovers. I heard you were the one who helped him when he was sick in the forest." What sounded like a casual question was laced with skepticism. Elena didn't respond immediately. She recognized Dona Mercedes's type, not interested in what you've done, only where you come from, and whether you're qualified to stand before her. "I didn't heal him," Elena replied. "I was simply there when he needed someone. The healing was heaven's mercy." Dona Mercedes raised an eyebrow. She was about to speak again when Alejandro emerged from the house. "Mother, you invited them into our home, Alejandro. All three of them. A woman with no degree, 2 children with no pedigree in the house of the Ruiz Vegas." That question wasn't just aimed at her son. It struck Elena's heart directly. The air grew thick. Mateo shrank back. Marisol looked at her grandmother with proud, defensive eyes. Alejandro took a deep breath and answered, "Mother, thanks to Elena, Mateo is alive. And more than that, he's smiling again. No one in our medical network could do that. Not because they lacked skill, but because they lacked presence." Dona Mercedes opened her mouth to protest, but Alejandro raised his hand firmly. I'm not asking for permission. I'm informing you. Elena bowed her head not out of submission, but out of respect. But her gaze had changed. She had faced hunger, silence, and injustice. No woman, no matter how powerful, could make her feel small. Dona Mercedes turned away, her voice sharp as a blade. I hope you know what you're doing. This family's reputation cannot be gambled away on a whim of kindness. That evening, Elena sat alone in her small garden. The moon was absent, but soft patio lights glowed gently over the potted herbs like slivers of faith flickering in the dark. Carmen, the longtime housekeeper, approached quietly with a warm cup of tea. I'm sorry for what the senora said, she said softly. There's no need, Elena replied. Everyone has their own beliefs about worth. I'm simply different from her. I don't use social scales to measure people. Carmen nodded, her gaze filled with respect. You're not from here, Elena. But that's exactly why you're teaching all of us something far more important than etiquette. You're teaching us humanity. Elena smiled. In the distance, the sound of Mateo and Luisito laughing echoed from the playroom, free, joyful, like a mountain spring bursting through stone. She closed her eyes. Inside her, a dream was quietly growing, a dream of a world where no one has to choose between tradition and modernity, forest and city, bare feet and leather shoes, where all can exist together, as long as the heart remains. Later that afternoon, Elena was sorting her dried herbs on the balcony: mint leaves, chamomile, cinnamon bark, and rare varieties Alejandro had sent people to collect from remote mountain regions. She moved slowly, carefully, treating each leaf like a thread of memory worth preserving. Alejandro appeared at the doorway without a word. He stood there for a moment, watching her with the eyes of someone who was finally seeing the woman who had quietly reshaped his entire world. May I sit with you? Elena turned and nodded gently. He sat across from her on the wicker chair. A breeze stirred the hanging herbs, carrying with it a fragrance of earth, sky, and something beyond words, something ancient. After a moment, Alejandro spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. Time flies. It's been almost a month since you arrived. Elena smiled, still looking toward the garden. Yes. A lot has changed, but we're getting used to it. He stared into the distance, then exhaled deeply. Elena, I've thought a lot. About you, your children, and Mateo. Elena turned toward him, her eyes calm but deep, like a lake that never ripples unless stirred by a real wind. I want to invite you to stay, not just for a few weeks like we agreed. I mean long term. Permanently, if you're willing. Elena's heart skipped a beat. She looked at him, expression unreadable. What do you mean? Not as a worker. Not just to care for Mateo. But, as part of my family. I want to build a center for integrative medicine where traditional healing is honored alongside modern science. And I want you to lead it. Elena didn't respond right away. She looked down, her thoughts swirling. Her logical mind told her this was a life-changing opportunity for Marisol, for Luisito, for herself. But a deeper part felt afraid. Afraid of losing herself, of becoming an ornament in a system she never trusted. I don't have a degree. I'm not a doctor. I'm just a woman who knows how to use leaves and the prayers of my ancestors. Alejandro shook his head firmly. You have something no diploma can teach: intuition, presence, and unconditional compassion. Those are what healed Mateo. And that is what's healing me. Elena fell silent. The wind rustled the rosemary. Her eyes blurred. She thought of her mother, a woman who had never seen the city lights but raised her on stories of Buddha, karma, and doing what's right without needing praise. I need to think and talk to my children. I can't decide alone. Of course, Alejandro said quietly. Just don't dismiss it too quickly. Because I believe this isn't just an offer. It's a chance to change something bigger, a bridge between two worlds. He stood and bowed slightly, not as a man of power, but as a student before a teacher. Not out of courtesy, but reverence. Elena remained seated. The sunset stretched across the garden like a thin red veil covering her life, beautiful, but full of unknowns. She didn't know what the future would hold. But in that moment, she heard something clearly in her heart. If I can help bring people closer, not by making them the same, not by changing them, but simply by seeing each other, then I cannot turn away. Mateo's birthday arrived like a strange milestone. Not just for him, but for Elena and her two children as well. It wasn't merely a celebration, it was her first real test as a barefoot woman walking into a world of polished elegance, where smiles could be kind, or sharp as blades. Alejandro hosted the party in the back garden of the estate. Galaxy-colored streamers floated above, with miniature planets suspended midair by magnetic technology, as if Mateo now had an entire universe to himself. Children from international schools filled the space, sons and daughters of friends, business partners, and tycoons, dressed in silk and satin, switching fluently between Spanish and English. Elena wore a hand-embroidered white dress picked out by Carmen, her hair neatly braided by Marisol. She didn't stand out and she didn't want to. But for some, her presence alone was already a fashion error. She stood quietly at the back, watching Mateo beam as he received one gift after another, a German-imported remote control car, a space-themed Lego set, a signed jersey from a world-famous soccer player. Each was wrapped in shiny paper with ribbons as wide as crowns. Then came her turn. Elena stepped forward with a small package wrapped in carefully folded newspaper and tied with a simple string of twine. Mateo took it, intrigued. He tore the paper open. Inside was a handmade telescope crafted from PVC pipe, with lenses salvaged from an old pair of glasses, and Mateo carved into the side using a utility knife. Accompanying it was a hand-drawn star map by Marisol, constellations, Tzotzil folk legends about the Milky Way, solar eclipses, the morning star. The garden fell silent for a few seconds. Then Mateo exclaimed, "Wow, es incredible. Wow. It's amazing." He threw his arms around Elena. "You made this? With your hands?" "With my hands, and my heart," she answered softly. But only minutes later, the atmosphere shifted. Alejandro stepped forward and signaled the staff to reveal the special gift. A section of the garden, hidden under a tarp, was pulled back to unveil a private observatory built just for Mateo, a high-end Japanese telescope, a real-time sky tracking model connected to NASA data, a bedroom ceiling star projection system. The children screamed in excitement. Parents murmured in awe. Mateo's eyes widened. Elena stepped back, still holding the now overlooked box she had made. No one said anything bad about her gift. But the glances, the whispers, the unspoken comparisons, they all pierced her like tiny thorns. Who is that kid so close to him? The maid. Strange, she's even standing there. She's talented, sure. But she's stepping out of line. Each word felt like ice water splashed across her face. Mateo didn't notice. He ran back to her. "Tonight, can we use your telescope first? Then Dad's." Elena nodded, forcing a smile through the ache. The party went on. But a hollow space formed inside Elena. She wasn't hated, but she wasn't welcomed either. To many, she wasn't a medical partner or the woman who saved the air, just an exception, soon to fade back into the shadows. As night fell and the children ran to the new observatory, Elena stood quietly beneath a tree. Carmen came over. "Are you all right?" "I've stood in forests, floods, and moonless nights," Elena replied. "But I've never felt so empty as I do in this crowd." Carmen held her hand. "Don't let the lights blind the truth. You don't need to shine brighter than them. You only need to be more real. And you already are." Elena gave a faint smile. But in that very moment, a voice rang out from the terrace, cold, proud, and heavy with judgment. "How strange. Alejandro gives the big gift, and the maid brings a wooden toy. Seems like this family is losing its balance." It was Dona Mercedes, speaking to her group. And they laughed. Not loudly, but loud enough for Elena to know, her dream of belonging was never going to be easy. She turned and quietly walked inside. No one noticed. No one called after her. She didn't cry. But Elena's eyes carried the most dangerous feeling of the wounded, cold detachment. After the dazzling birthday celebration, Elena quietly gathered the handmade telescope Matteo had clutched with joy in the beginning, now left forgotten on a side table near the garden. She wasn't angry with Matteo, his eyes still lit up when he spoke of Miss Elena's telescope. But the mocking laughter, the critical looks, and especially the words "this family is losing balance" lingered like a slow, silent wound. That night, with Marisol and Luisito asleep in their warm rooms, Elena sat by the window, staring into the city garden lit by electric lights. The grass no longer smelled of home. The breeze didn't carry birdsong. Here, the only thing floating in the air was artificial light and unspoken expectations, a world where someone like her, a native woman with no degree, no pedigree, was expected to walk softly, speak gently, smile modestly. She reached under the bed for her old suitcase, the same one she had carried from Chiapas. The mud stain from the night Matteo burned with fever was still there. She began to pack. An hour later, the door opened. Alejandro stood there. "What are you doing?" he asked softly. "I think it's time to go home. Because of my mother's words." "Not just her." Elena turned, her eyes red but dry. "Because this house, this place makes my children feel like they must fit the clothes just right, speak the language just right, and measure their worth by faces not their own." Alejandro stepped in and closed the door. He wasn't in a suit. No prestige, no titles. Just a man, tired eyes, defenses slowly falling. "Elena, don't let a few voices define your place here. The problem is, I don't need to be defined, Alejandro," she said, voice low, each word heavy as stone. "I need to be respected. Not politely pitied. Not conditionally praised." He reached out instinctively, but Elena stepped back. Not coldly. Just, clearly. "I'm grateful. For the chance. The trust. But I came here to help Matteo. Not to survive in a world that only lets me stay if I make others feel safe." "You don't understand," Alejandro whispered. "You've become more than that to me, to Matteo. Then give me the dignity to leave as a free woman. Not a savior on display. Not a guest held by obligation." The next morning, Carmen found the room spotless. Marisol left a note for Matteo. "Thank you for showing me another world. But my home is beautiful too. I hope you'll visit someday." Luisito scribbled in pencil. I like the city, but I miss my chickens more. Alejandro stood motionless in the living room, the space where the children had played each afternoon. Carmen approached, her eyes soft with sympathy. Sir, she's gone. Alejandro clenched his fist. In his mind echoed Elena's laughter, the image of her in the herb garden, hair tousled, eyes serene. He had never known a woman so strong and so gentle, and never had anyone left his life leaving such a void. He turned to Carmen. Prepare the car. I'm going to Chiapas. Carmen raised an eyebrow. You're going to bring her back? No, Alejandro answered, voice firm. I'm going to ask if she's willing to let me become part of her world. Not the other way around. Back in her brown earthen home, Elena stood in the doorway, looking out at her herb garden, still vibrant, still alive. The scent of damp rice grass, the call of roosters, and the morning mist felt unchanged. But her heart had changed. It had learned how to love not through silent sacrifice, but through knowing when to walk away. On her first morning back in Chiapas, Elena woke before the rooster crowed. She didn't need an alarm clock, her body was synced with the rustling of leaves, the faint stirring of earthworms, and the soft footfalls of her daughter Marisol, as quiet as dew on the wooden floor. She draped herself in an old shawl and opened the door of her earthen house. The scent of damp grass after the rain filled her senses, washing away the lingering stress of those days spent among the concrete and glass of the capital. Her herb garden was still intact. Under Dona Rosario's care, the lemon balm, mugwort, patchouli all had thrived. Elena knelt, touched each stem and root, whispering a quiet prayer of gratitude. Mama, I remember this one. When I had that bad cough, you made steam from it. I thought I was gonna die, but after that, I was fine again. Luisito laughed as he ran into the yard. That's mountain mint, Elena said, her eyes shining. It doesn't just heal, it helps you remember who you are. Marisol didn't speak. She stood still, gazing at the familiar plot of land. There was no longer fear in her eyes, not the timid gaze of a country girl stepping into mansions and luxury cars. Her eyes held maturity, as if she now understood that you have to leave home to truly know what can never be replaced. At noon, Dona Rosario stopped by with some fresh corn cakes and a whisper. I heard. That man, the head of the hospital, he seems sincere. Elena smiled. The old woman might be elderly, but her instincts were as sharp as ever. He wants to come back here. He does. And he will. But this time, I don't think he's coming with an offer to take you to the rich man's world. He's coming to ask if he can step into yours. Elena fell silent. Rosario went on, gently smoothing her scarf. Mija, a woman's life isn't measured by how many times she's honored, but by how many times she knows when to stand tall and when to say no to what doesn't feel right. But don't close your door to things that might grow with you. The words sank in like rainwater into dry earth. Elena didn't answer. She just looked at the wind chime hanging from the porch made of seashells Mateo had picked during their outing. That afternoon, the three of them walked to the field. Luisito hugged his familiar rooster. Marisol sat writing in her journal beneath the old mango tree. Elena brought her notebook too. In it, she recorded every traditional remedy she knew, cures for fevers, coughs, insomnia, stomach pain. But this time, she added notes in proper Spanish so she could someday send them to Alejandro. Not to ask for a job, but to share knowledge. She wasn't turning her back on the city. But she wasn't willing to trade her roots just to be accepted either. 2 days later, a familiar car pulled up at the village gate. Alejandro stepped out not in a tailored suit, but in a white shirt and dusty gray trousers. No security guards. No grand gifts. No rehearsed speech. Just a man walking slowly toward Elena's gate, heart pounding like a boy visiting his crush's family for the first time. Elena was already waiting. Not with longing, but with clarity. "I don't want anyone to be grateful to me for life," she said, "and I don't want to be a special person just to survive in your world." Alejandro nodded. He didn't argue. His eyes were steady, sincere. "I understand. That's why I'm here to ask, may I enter your world? One with rooster calls, healing herbs, red earth clinging to bare heels, not to change anything. Just to live alongside it?" Elena looked at him. For a long time. Then she turned gently to Marisol. "Sweetheart, what would you think, if someone like him wanted to live among our herbs?" Marisol smiled a smile no longer shy, no longer the city girl's hesitation. "If he's willing to get his hands dirty with compost, then I say yes." Luisito shouted. "Does that mean I get to teach Mateo how to raise chickens?" Everyone burst into laughter. Elena nodded softly. This time, it wasn't a rejection. It was an opening. On her terms. The next morning, dawn light slipped through the cracks of the earthen house. Alejandro lay asleep on a bamboo cot outside, covered with a thin blanket, head resting on his travel bag. For the first time in his life, he woke not to air conditioning but to crickets chirping, and roosters instead of alarms. His back ached a little, but he hadn't slept that well in years. In the kitchen, Elena was boiling water for ginger tea. The scent of crushed ginger mixed with wild lemon leaves drifted through the little home familiar to the locals, yet completely new to a man raised among glass and steel. Marisol sliced green mango, sprinkling it with chili salt. Luisito raced around holding his prized chicken, laughing and yelling. "She laid an egg. I told you. City chickens don't know how to lay." Mateo sat under the porch, pants stained with soil, cheeks glowing with sunlight. His eyes were clear like a new morning after a long illness. He giggled, not a trace left of the cold, distant boy he used to be. Alejandro walked into the kitchen, hair tousled, shirt wrinkled. "I've never had breakfast without toast and espresso." "We don't have espresso here," Elena replied, handing him a clay cup with a sly smile, "but this tea might just make you forget coffee ever existed." He took a sip. Eyes widened. "Oh wow, how is this good?" "The secret is the firewood. And a heart that doesn't rush." That afternoon, the whole family walked to a small plot of land near the stream. Once Elena's father's field. Alejandro wore old jeans Marisol had dug out from a backup pile and a straw hat that Luisito had ceremoniously appointed him with. Together, they built a small hut, Alejandro's temporary shelter during his stay in Chiapas. No one forced him. No one treated him like a guest of honor. He was the newcomer like every newcomer who ever returned to this place. He had to learn how to carry water, how to haul medicinal herbs, how to sense the rain by the smell of the soil. And he did learn. With complete humility. In the evenings, under the warm flicker of an oil lamp, Elena would tell him about the remedies passed down from her grandmother, how to use honeysuckle to detox the blood, how to dry wild anise roots just right, how to listen to the rustle of leaves and know when the seasons were shifting. "You could buy a mobile clinic, bring an entire lab here," she once said, "but if you can't hear the voice of the earth, it's all meaningless." Alejandro nodded. His voice was quiet. I want to learn. Not to use it, but to understand. Because my son needs to know, not everything of value comes from the city. Elena looked at him for a long time, then spoke soft, but firm. I don't need anyone to prove they deserve me. I just need someone who can be with me, without asking me to leave any part of myself behind. Alejandro didn't respond. He simply pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, an updated design sketch of the Integrative Medicine Center. I made some changes. Your name is no longer on the sign. The name of this land is. At the top of the page, bold letters read, Centro Raiz Viva, the Living Root Center. A place where ancestral knowledge is heard and protected. Elena held the paper in her hands, silent. But in her eyes was a light brighter than the setting sun. The light of trust, finally placed where it belonged. That night, with the children asleep, Elena sat on the porch, rewebbing an old basket. Alejandro stepped out, holding a cup of ginger tea, his first attempt at making it on his own. Not sure I got the flavor right. Elena took a sip and smiled. It's a bit bitter. But it's real. Better than fake sweet, right? Yes, she nodded. We're starting over. Not with each other but with ourselves. And if we can hold on to that truth, maybe we'll last longer. Alejandro didn't answer. He simply sat beside her, under a sky filled with stars where one didn't need a telescope to feel the universe opening up. And maybe, for the first time in his life, Alejandro Ruiz Vega realized. He had entered a world that required no key. Only a heart that was honest enough. 2 weeks later, Elena's small village witnessed what the locals playfully called the White Storm. A soft white van rolled into town with green letters painted boldly on the side. Centro Raiz Viva, medicine from the root. No sirens. No loudspeakers. No grand slogans. Just a quiet door opening, and Alejandro's footsteps echoing slow, certain as though stepping into the first ceremony of his life's true purpose. Alongside him were a Western-trained doctor, a translator, and Carmen, who had left the city by choice to manage the project. Carmen's proud smile said it all. It's the first time I've seen Mr. Alejandro skip an international medical conference, just to plant ginger. Alejandro grinned. The Living Root Center wasn't built with cold concrete. It was made of wood, packed earth, river stones, and bamboo. Its architecture was inspired by traditional Tzotzil homes with wide leaf roofs, an open courtyard at its heart, and a medicinal herb garden that wrapped around the structure like a woven shawl of ancestral wisdom. No one was called patient. They were returning seekers. No one was called doctor. They were guides. The opening ceremony had no red ribbon, no media coverage. Just a human chain, villagers, children, indigenous healers, and city-based physicians forming what Elena called the circle of humility. She stepped into that circle, wearing a traditional embroidered Tzotzil dress, her hair tied with a violet ribbon the color of Mother Earth. Before her stood Alejandro, in a plain earth-toned shirt, no Swiss watch, no Italian shoes. Just a man standing quietly, waiting to speak after her. Elena raised her hand. Her voice was soft, but reached deep. This center wasn't born to replace any form of healing. It was born so we no longer have to choose between science and tradition. It is a space where everyone can be heard, whether you have a degree, or just generations of memory. The crowd applauded. But it was their eyes that Elena noticed most. Eyes full of true recognition, not because of power or pedigree, but because the seeds she'd sown had finally taken root. After her, Alejandro stepped forward. No speech. He simply bowed and placed a hand over his heart. I once believed that wisdom required titles, and power demanded prestige. But a woman taught me, sometimes the strongest medicine is trust. And the most lasting cure is compassion. He turned to Elena. She didn't just save my son. She taught me how to be a father. She taught me how to be a man. And starting today, I hope we can all relearn how to be human. By returning to the simplest thing, a sincere heart. The crowd erupted in emotion. Mateo, now dressed in soft woven fabric, ran up with a notebook Marisol had filled with drawings of medicinal plants. He handed it to his father. On the cover was a child's scribbled line, in Tzotzil, Spanish, and English. Healing doesn't begin in hospitals. It begins with love. Elena looked at her daughter, her son, at Mateo, at Alejandro. And in that moment, she knew. This was no longer just her story. It was a movement. A quiet revolution. No protests. No speeches. Just one woman. One heart. And a piece of earth that knew how to speak. That night, in the courtyard of her earthen home, Elena sat beside Alejandro. The three children lay in hammocks, listening to fairy tales in 3 languages. The wind stirred the clothesline, gently ringing the wind chime. The same one Mateo had rebuilt from seashells during their outing. You know, Elena said quietly, I once thought we were too different to ever walk together. And now, I think we are different. But we've learned how to see each other without judgment. Alejandro took her hand not for the first time, but for the first time without trembling. And that, he said, is the beginning of a family. A rooster crowed into the early night. Elena smiled. Sounds like another egg from our little hen. Luisito's going to wake the whole village tomorrow. They laughed. Not because of anything big, but because they knew. Sometimes happiness is just hearing a rooster crow. With someone beside you. And a heart that finally feels light. That morning, just as Elena set down a bowl of ginger broth in front of an elderly man suffering from a cold, Carmen rushed breathlessly into the Reyes Viva Center, hands trembling as she held out a thick envelope bearing the bright red seal of the National Ministry of Health. Her face was pale, her lips quivering. Inspection order. Elena took it. She wasn't surprised. She had felt this coming. There was no way a center that dared to combine traditional and modern medicine wouldn't stir the waters of massive interest groups. The letter was brief, just 3 paragraphs. The Reyes Viva Center is suspected of unauthorized medical activity. Use of unverified traditional remedies on patients. All operations are suspended for 15 days for a full inspection. Carmen whispered in shock. Someone reported us. Maybe a private pharmaceutical group. Maybe. Elena cut her off. I know who. She didn't say the name. But her gaze toward the faraway city said everything. Dona Mercedes. The woman who once sipped wine on her marble terrace and declared that Elena would never be worthy of the Ruiz Vega name, and now, couldn't bear that Alejandro had not only stepped outside the world she built, but had helped build another one she couldn't control. Alejandro received the news in the middle of a closed-door investment forum in the capital. He left the meeting without a word, ignoring the puzzled stares, and rushed to Chiapas. But this time, he wasn't alone. 3 senior physicians, each with experience at the World Health Organization, were with him. They had reviewed the Reyes Viva proposal before. And they had been moved. Not by data, but by the unquantifiable humanity it carried. "If this is a battle between knowledge and power," said one as their vehicle touched the red soil of Chiapas, "then we choose to stand with true knowledge." The day of the inspection, rain poured like judgment. But villagers lined the road in front of the Raíz Vivas Center. No one told them to. They came because they knew, if this place was shut down, they wouldn't just lose access to healing for their bodies, but healing for their dignity. Elders leaned on canes. Children clutched dolls. Mothers held sleeping infants. No signs. No shouting. Just silence, like a wall of flesh and bone standing guard before a humble thatched clinic. When the inspector stepped out in a black suit, he froze. Not because of the crowd, but because of the hundreds of eyes watching him. Not with fear, but with trust. Elena stepped forward. No elegant dress. No high heels. Just a simple earth-toned blouse embroidered at the collar with rosemary. She extended her hands. She did not bow. "I am ready to cooperate." The inspection lasted 10 hours. Every medicine jar was labeled and documented. Every patient record bore the signatures of both a traditional healer and a Western-trained doctor. No signs of fraud. No black market remedies. No exploitation. By late afternoon, the sun broke through. The inspector emerged, holding a preliminary report. His voice rang clear in the quiet. "We found no serious violations. All traditional practices are conducted under strict supervision. The Raíz Vivas Center is authorized to continue operations." The crowd wept. No cheers. Just silent tears running down the sun-weathered faces of farmers, laborers, mothers, and elders. Elena turned away to hide her face. But Alejandro stepped forward and took her hand. "You don't have to hold it all together anymore. This is a victory, for honesty." "No," Elena whispered. "This is a victory, for trust. The one we both had lost." He nodded. They stood together. No crowns. No titles. Just two people once divided, now joined by the same fire. That night, beneath the rhythm of tzotzil drums, Mateo stood in the courtyard of the center, clutching a tiny microphone, trembling as he read a speech before the village. He had written it himself, not with textbook knowledge from the city, but with the heart of a boy who had once been saved by a woman the world deemed unworthy of trust. "I used to think I was just a weak little kid. But thanks to Miss Elena, I know now. Weakness can be strength if it comes from love rooted deep." The courtyard went silent. Elena wept. For the first time she didn't hide her tears. 1 month after Raíz Vivas survived the threat of closure, the final rains of the season gave way to the clear blue sky above the Chiapas highlands. The herbs in Elena's garden stood taller, their leaves wider, veins thick with new life. As if the earth itself had been reborn with her. That morning, Elena received a letter from the last person she expected. Dona Mercedes. The paper carried a faint lavender scent. The handwriting, slanted but steady. There was no direct apology. But something rarer. An acknowledgement. "I was wrong. Not because you won Alejandro or Mateo, but because I forgot that pride should never grow larger than gratitude. If you ever needed an enemy to forge your strength, perhaps I played that role better than I intended." Elena didn't smile. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on the altar beside her mother's photo. She looked upward, her eyes quiet. Then lit a single stick of incense. Not to ask for anything. Just to breathe. In peace. That weekend, Mateo, Marisol, and Luisito launched a big project, transforming the old field behind the house into a natural learning garden. A place where children would learn letters, plants, and life not through textbooks, but through experience. Luisito hammered together wooden boards to label each plant. This one's mint. But don't eat too much, it'll cool your belly too fast. Marisol created a star map at the garden center, linking constellations to herbs. Altair is the lotus. Vega is holy basil. Mateo, now a confident young boy, began writing a bilingual journal in Spanish and Tzotzil, documenting folk remedies, their uses, and the stories behind each plant. Alejandro sat on the porch, typing the first pages of his book. Raíz Viva, When Healing Begins with Trust. The cover did not bear his name alone. It read clearly. Co-authors, Elena Gomez and the Chiapas community. That evening, the whole family gathered around the fire. Carmen was telling a Tzotzil ghost story in her warm, husky voice. The children huddled together, both terrified and thrilled. Elena stirred a pot of fresh rice porridge, sprinkling scallions and purple perilla leaves on top, the aroma sweet and comforting. Alejandro poured her a glass of iced Draconta melon water. He was no longer the hospital CEO, but a man who had learned to carry water, wash baskets, soothe children, and quietly love a woman who didn't need him to hold her up, only to walk beside her. "Do you remember the first day we met?" he asked. "I do. I thought you were a dead man walking, sinking in mud, wearing Italian shoes in the forest. And I thought I had just met a woman who didn't belong to this world. And maybe I was right, you belong to something deeper than the world." Elena laughed without hesitation. "You don't have to give me anything grand. Just let me wake up every morning, see the kids healthy, watch dew clinging to the leaves, that's enough." Alejandro nodded. "You are the greatest gift life ever slipped into my hands during the muddiest rainstorm I've ever lived through." They clinked their glasses. No wine. No cake. No grand banquet. Just a quiet feast of truth and growth. Elsewhere in the country, news outlets began to mention Raíz Viva as the first government-supported community health model that integrated Eastern and Western medicine. A documentary filmmaker started filming in Chiapas. Medical students signed up to volunteer, not to learn advanced procedures, but to learn how to truly see people with their eyes and their hearts. In a small open-air classroom in the garden, Elena stood in front of young students, showing them how to boil licorice and polycias root. "You've learned to diagnose hundreds of symptoms. But also learn this. Look at a person, and see their loneliness. Because sometimes, illness isn't in the blood. It's in the soul." One student bowed their head. And Elena stepped out into the sun. Light streaming through her hair like threads of gold. The story goes like this. There once was an indigenous woman who saved the son of a billionaire. Not with pharmaceuticals, but with heart and ancestral wisdom. She didn't change the world. She simply held onto her roots and let the world come closer to them. A living root. A truthful heart. A silent breeze. Strong enough to bend the entire system. Thank you for joining us. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share. What did this story teach you? How might it shape the way you live or forgive? Your voice matters. Reading your reflections brings strength, healing, and inspiration to us all. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us create more stories that awaken the soul. Thank you for watching. and we'll see you in the next video.